Steam rises from grates along Michigan Avenue on a frigid January morning in 1910. Below the cobblestones, 60 feet down, a train whistle echoes through brick-lined chambers that most Detroiters will never see. The tunnel stretches for more than a mile beneath the city streets, its vaulted ceiling dripping with condensation as a massive locomotive pulls passenger cars through the underground passage. Up above, horse-drawn carriages and the first automobiles navigate through slush and crowds, completely unaware that beneath their wheels, an entire railroad system operates in absolute darkness. This was Detroit's great engineering gamble, a solution to a problem that plagued every major American city at the turn of the century. But while New York buried its trains in cut-and-cover trenches and Chicago elevated its railways above the streets, Detroit chose something different entirely. Something more audacious. Something that would ultimately define the city's relationship with infrastructure in ways its builders could never have anticipated. The Michigan Central Railroad Tunnel wasn't just a passage under a river. It was an entire subterranean network that represented a fundamental question. How do you move thousands of people and tons of freight through the heart of a rapidly growing city without destroying that city in the process? By 1900, Detroit's railroad problem had become untenable. The Michigan Central Railroad operated the largest depot in the city, a sprawling complex along the riverfront where trains from Chicago, Buffalo, and points beyond converged. Every single one of those trains had to cross city streets at grade level. 3rd Street, Fort Street, Jefferson Avenue, Michigan Avenue. Each crossing meant delays, accidents, and an ever-present danger to pedestrians. The statistics were damning. Between 1895 and 1905, grade-level railroad crossings in Detroit resulted in 127 documented fatalities. Children playing near the tracks, workers crossing between shifts, carriage drivers misjudging the speed of approaching locomotives. The newspapers called it the slaughter, and city officials faced mounting pressure to do something, anything, to separate the trains from the street traffic. Compare this to New York's solution. The New York Central and Hudson River Railroad, facing similar pressures in Manhattan, began building the Grand Central Terminal Complex in 1903. Their approach: electrify the trains, bury the tracks in shallow trenches covered with iron gratings, and rebuild the entire rail yard as a 2-level subterranean operation. Cost: approximately $180 million by the time it was completed in 1913. Chicago chose elevation instead. Starting in the 1890s, the city systematically raised its railroad tracks onto massive steel trestles, creating an entirely new layer of urban infrastructure suspended above the streets. The Loop got its name from these elevated tracks. Cost: roughly $50 million across multiple railroad companies over 2 decades. Detroit couldn't afford New York's solution, and after seeing how Chicago's elevated railways cast permanent shadows over entire neighborhoods, turning prosperous streets into dark, noisy corridors avoided by shoppers and residents alike, city planners balked at that option too. What made Detroit's situation unique was geography. The Michigan Central Railroad's main line ran west from its riverfront depot, but to reach the company's massive freight yards in the western suburbs, trains had to cross not just city streets, but also the Rouge River and several major industrial areas. Grade separations would need to account for dozens of intersections, multiple water crossings, and the complex topography of a city built on the Detroit River's clay banks. William J. Wilgus, the chief engineer of the New York Central, who masterminded Grand Central Terminal, visited Detroit in 1903 to consult on the problem. His assessment was blunt. Detroit's terrain makes shallow cut-and-cover tunneling nearly impossible. The water table sits barely 12 feet below street level. Any trench deep enough to accommodate railroad clearances would flood continuously. You would need to go much deeper, or go above. The Michigan Central Railroad's Board of Directors faced a choice that would determine the next half-century of Detroit's development. They hired their own engineer, a Scottish-born tunnel specialist named William Mason, who had worked on the Liverpool Overhead Railway and London's deep-level tube tunnels. Mason's proposal a bore tunnel, driven through the clay beneath the city at a depth where the water table ceased to be a factor, running from the riverfront depot all the way to the western freight yards. The estimated cost? $6 million, less than a third of what New York was spending on Grand Central. The catch? It would require technology that had never been used in America on this scale. Mason knew his proposal would sound radical to American railroad executives. In 1903, no major American railroad operated trains through deep-bore tunnels. The technology was European, developed in London and Paris, where older cities with medieval street patterns made surface railroad construction impossible. The London Underground's first deep-level tube line, the City and South London Railway, opened in 1890. It used electric locomotives to pull small passenger cars through circular tunnels just over 10 feet in diameter, bored through London clay using hydraulic shields. The Paris Metro, which began operation in 1900, used similar technology adapted for larger tunnel diameters. But those were passenger railways using small electric trains. The Michigan Central needed to move full-size steam locomotives, pulling strings of heavy freight cars and passenger coaches. The trains weighed hundreds of tons. The locomotives measured over 60 feet in length and stood more than 15 feet tall. No one had ever bored a tunnel large enough to accommodate such traffic. Mason's pitch emphasized what Detroit would gain by following European precedent. In London, the tube railways had solved traffic problems without disrupting surface streets. Businesses above the tunnels continued operating during construction. Properties maintained their value. The city kept functioning while its transportation infrastructure was completely rebuilt underground. Compare that to Chicago's experience with elevation. When the Lake Street Elevated Railway opened in 1893, property values along the route dropped by an average of 32% according to contemporary real estate assessments. Stores closed, residents moved away. The elevated structure created a dividing line through the city that persists to this day. Or consider New York's cut-and-cover approach. Building Grand Central Terminal required demolishing 6 city blocks. For years, Midtown Manhattan was a construction zone of excavation pits and steam-powered derricks. Businesses relocated, streets closed. The disruption was total. Detroit could avoid all that. Mason proposed a tunnel that would be invisible on the surface, built by miners working underground, while the city above continued its normal routine. The Michigan Central Railroad accepted Mason's proposal in late 1903, but with one critical modification. While European tunnels used electric locomotives, Detroit's tunnel would continue operating steam trains. Electrification was expensive, and the Michigan Central's entire fleet consisted of coal-fired locomotives. Converting to electric power would require rebuilding, not just the tunnel, but also the railroad's entire western infrastructure. This decision made Detroit's tunnel project unique in world railroad engineering. Nowhere else would steam locomotives operate through such a long, deep tunnel. The engineering challenges were immense. How do you ventilate a mile-long tunnel filled with coal smoke? How do you prevent locomotives from losing traction on steep grades in a confined space? How do you ensure that ash and cinders from the firebox don't accumulate on the rails? Mason's solution involved 3 interconnected systems working simultaneously. First, massive ventilation shafts every quarter mile connected to steam-powered fans that would pull smoke and fumes up to the surface. Second, a water spray system along the entire tunnel length to dampen coal dust and prevent fires. Third, a reduced grade profile that would allow locomotives to maintain speed without excessive wheel slip. The ventilation shafts became the tunnel's most visible feature. 8 brick towers rose from street level along Michigan Avenue, each one standing 40 feet tall and 12 feet in diameter. Inside each tower, enormous cast-iron fans rotated continuously, powered by steam engines in basement chambers. The sound was constant, a low thrum that residents near the tunnel route learned to ignore, the way New Yorkers learned to tune out the rattle of elevated trains. Construction began in January 1905. While New York and Chicago had built their railroad improvements using armies of laborers with shovels and horse-drawn carts, Detroit's tunnel required specialized workers: hard rock miners from Michigan's Upper Peninsula copper mines, bricklayers experienced in curved arch construction, and sandhogs who had worked on sewer tunnels in other cities. The boring technique Mason employed was called clay kicking, a method developed in London's clay-heavy soil. Miners worked in teams of 3. One man lay on his back in a wooden frame, using his feet to drive a narrow spade into the clay face at the tunnel's leading edge. A second man pulled away the cut clay, while a third installed wooden support frames as the tunnel advanced. Behind them, bricklayers followed, lining the tunnel with curved walls 3 bricks thick. Progress measured in feet per day. On good days, working 2 shifts, the crews advanced 12 feet. On bad days, when they hit pockets of sand or underground springs, progress slowed to 3 or 4 feet, or stopped entirely while engineers figured out how to shore up the wet ground. The tunnel's depth varied between 55 and 70 feet below street level, following the natural geology. Where the clay was dense and stable, they went shallower. Where they encountered sandy layers or groundwater, they went deeper. The grade profile resembled a gentle roller coaster, nothing like the perfectly flat tunnels of modern subways. Contemporary accounts from the Detroit Free Press describe the work as proceeding in absolute darkness, guided only by compass and the glow of oil lamps. The miners worked in teams, each team responsible for a section of tunnel. Competition between crews became fierce. Foremen bet on which team would advance the farthest in a week. Workers took pride in being the fast gang, or the rock gang, depending on their specialization. Comparing Detroit's tunnel construction to concurrent projects elsewhere reveals interesting contrasts. The Pennsylvania Railroad's Hudson River tunnels, begun in 1903 to connect New York and New Jersey, used massive iron tunnel shields driven by hydraulic rams. Progress was faster, but the cost was astronomical. The Hudson tunnels eventually cost $114 million for less than 2 miles of bore. Detroit's clay kicking method was slower but vastly cheaper. The Michigan Central's entire tunnel project, including the 8 ventilation towers and the underground switching yards at each end, came in at $6.2 million when it opened in 1910. Per-mile costs were less than a fifth of what New York was spending. When the tunnel opened for freight service in December 1909, the ventilation system immediately proved inadequate. Steam locomotives idling underground while waiting for switching signals filled the tunnel with dense, sulfurous smoke. The ventilation fans, designed to handle smoke from moving trains, couldn't keep up with the accumulated fumes from stationary locomotives. Engineers quickly realized that operating steam trains underground required completely different protocols than surface operation. Firemen had to learn to bank their fires when approaching the tunnel, reducing coal consumption to minimize smoke production. Enginemen had to maintain momentum through the tunnel, avoiding stops wherever possible. Dispatchers had to coordinate traffic so that multiple trains never idled underground simultaneously. The solution was operational rather than technological. The Michigan Central developed a strict protocol. Trains entered the tunnel only when given specific clearance that they could proceed through without stopping. Signals every quarter mile showed green only when the section ahead was clear. Red signals meant trains had to wait on the surface until the tunnel cleared. Even with these precautions, the tunnel environment was brutal. Firemen and engineers working the tunnel route received extra pay, what was called tunnel differential in railroad parlance. On hot summer days, temperatures in the tunnel reached 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The air was thick with steam and smoke despite the ventilation. Breathing was difficult. Men who worked the tunnel route regularly developed chronic respiratory problems. Compare this to the experience of working the New York Central's electrified tunnels under Manhattan. Clean, cool, quiet. Motormen operated their trains in relative comfort. No coal smoke, no scalding steam, no danger of running out of air in a stalled train. The technological superiority of electric traction was obvious to anyone who worked both systems. Yet electrification remained too expensive for the Michigan Central. The railroad operated on thin margins. Every dollar spent on infrastructure was a dollar not paid to shareholders. The steam tunnel, uncomfortable and dangerous as it was for workers, remained profitable. That was all that mattered. Passenger service through the tunnel began in January 1910. For travelers arriving in Detroit from Chicago or Buffalo, the tunnel approach was unlike anything they had experienced on other railroads. As the train descended the grade approaching the tunnel mouth, darkness swallowed the windows. The temperature rose noticeably. The sound changed. The rhythmic clacking of wheels on rails now echoed off brick walls, amplified and distorted. Contemporary travel writers described the sensation. A 1912 article in Harper's Weekly noted, "The passage through Detroit's railroad tunnel produces a peculiar feeling of descent, as if one were traveling not merely under the city, but into some deeper realm entirely. The darkness is absolute, except for occasional glimpses of gas lights mounted along the tunnel walls. The air grows close and warm. Conversation becomes difficult over the locomotive's laboring exhaust, which reverberates through the enclosed space with a pulsing, rhythmic intensity." The tunnel experience lasted roughly 8 minutes for passenger trains, which maintained speeds between 15 and 20 miles per hour underground. Freight trains moved slower, sometimes taking 15 minutes to traverse the full tunnel length. Those 8 to 15 minutes became a ritual for regular passengers, a brief interlude of darkness and sound that marked arrival in Detroit. Other railroads serving Detroit took notice. The Grand Trunk Railway, which operated a competing line into the city, considered building its own tunnel. Engineers studied the Michigan Central system and produced cost estimates. But the Grand Trunks Board decided the expense wasn't justified. They opted instead for grade separations at major crossings, using short underpasses where streets dipped beneath the tracks, a cheaper if less comprehensive solution. The Pennsylvania Railroad, entering Detroit from the east, chose elevation. Their approach to the downtown depot crossed streets on massive steel trestles, creating exactly the shadowed corridors Detroit had hoped to avoid by building the Michigan Central Tunnel. The contrast was stark. One railroad buried its trains, another raised them aloft, both solving the same problem using opposite means. Between 1910 and 1920, the Michigan Central Tunnel handled an enormous volume of traffic. Detroit's population exploded during this period, growing from 466,000 in 1910 to over 993,000 by 1920. The automobile industry drove this growth. Ford, Chrysler, Packard, and dozens of smaller manufacturers established factories in Detroit and its suburbs. Those factories needed raw materials: steel, coal, rubber, glass. All of it arrived by rail. The Michigan Central's tunnel became a critical artery for this industrial traffic. Freight trains running 24 hours a day carried coal from Pennsylvania, iron ore from the Upper Peninsula, steel from Pittsburgh, and finished automobiles back out to markets across the country. The tunnel's capacity was tested constantly. During peak hours, trains entered every 6 minutes. Passenger traffic grew equally dramatic. The Michigan Central's downtown depot handled 148 trains daily by 1920, carrying businessmen, immigrants, soldiers, and tourists. The tunnel made this volume possible. Without it, grade-level crossings would have gridlocked the city's streets completely. Yet even as the tunnel demonstrated its value, signs of obsolescence appeared. Electric locomotives were proving their superiority on other railroads. The New York Central converted its entire Manhattan operation to electric power by 1913. The Pennsylvania Railroad electrified its Philadelphia-Harrisburg main line by 1915. The Milwaukee Road electrified 656 miles of its transcontinental route through the Rocky Mountains between 1915 and 1927. The Michigan Central's management watched these developments, but took no action. Steam locomotives remained cheaper to operate, they argued. The railroad's maintenance facilities were designed around steam technology. Conversion costs would be prohibitive. Year after year, the decision was deferred. The 1920s brought changes that would gradually undermine the tunnel's importance. automobiles and trucks began replacing trains for shorter distance freight hauling. Detroit's road network expanded. The first limited access highways appeared. Trucks could make deliveries directly to factory loading docks, something railroads couldn't match. Passenger traffic also started shifting. The Michigan Central's overnight trains to Chicago and Buffalo faced new competition from intercity bus companies offering cheaper fares. By 1930, bus lines had captured 15% of the Michigan Central's passenger traffic on routes under 300 miles. The tunnel itself began showing wear. 3 decades of continuous operation by heavy steam locomotives had damaged the brick lining. Water seepage was increasing. In several sections, the brick arch showed cracks. Engineers conducted studies and recommended a complete relining using reinforced concrete. Cost $2.3 million. The railroad's board declined to fund the work. Compare this to how other cities maintained their railroad infrastructure. New York's Grand Central Terminal underwent continuous maintenance and upgrades throughout the 1920s and 1930s. The Pennsylvania Railroad invested millions in maintaining its Hudson River tunnels. These railroads understood that infrastructure neglect compounds over time, turning minor repairs into major reconstructions. The Michigan Central's management took a different view. The tunnel still functioned. Trains still passed through it. Why spend money on repairs that weren't immediately necessary? This short-term thinking would have long-term consequences. World War II temporarily revived the tunnel's importance. Freight traffic surged as Detroit's factories converted to military production. Tanks, aircraft, munitions, all needed transportation. The Michigan Central's tunnel handled coal trains supplying power plants, steel trains feeding factories, and military freight moving to East Coast ports. During the war years, the tunnel operated at near capacity. The railroad hired additional maintenance crews to keep the aging system functional. Emergency repairs became routine. When ventilation fans failed, they were patched rather than replaced. When brick sections showed new cracks, crews applied mortar hastily and moved on. The goal was keeping traffic moving, not long-term sustainability. After the war ended, traffic declined again. Soldiers returning home bought automobiles. Families moved to suburbs. Interstate commerce shifted increasingly to trucks and highways. The tunnel's utilization dropped sharply. By 1950, only 60 freight trains per day used the tunnel, less than half the 1920 volume. The Pennsylvania Railroad, facing similar declines in rail traffic nationwide, began abandoning marginal routes and consolidating operations. The New York Central cut passenger service drastically. Both railroads lost money consistently throughout the 1950s. The Michigan Central, merged into the New York Central system in 1930, was equally troubled. The tunnel required major investment, new ventilation equipment, complete relining, modern signaling. None of these improvements were funded. The railroad's accountants calculated that abandoning the tunnel and routing trains around the city would be cheaper than proper maintenance. That calculation spelled doom. The Michigan Central Railroad Tunnel closed to through traffic in 1967. The last regular freight train passed through in November. The ventilation fans were shut down. The entrance portals were sealed with concrete. What had been Detroit's engineering triumph became another piece of abandoned infrastructure, left to slowly decay beneath the city's streets. Here's the irony. Detroit, which built the tunnel to avoid destroying its streets with surface railroads, spent the next 3 decades destroying those same streets to build freeways. The Lodge Freeway, the Fisher Freeway, the Edsel Ford Freeway, the Chrysler Freeway. Entire neighborhoods were demolished to create urban expressways that carried cars and trucks instead of trains. The very problem the tunnel solved, how to move transportation through the city without surface disruption, was solved again using exactly the approach Detroit had rejected in 1903, massive elevated structures and grade-level routes that severed neighborhoods and created permanent barriers through the urban fabric. Today, portions of the tunnel still exist beneath Michigan Avenue. Urban explorers occasionally find access points through old ventilation shafts. Their photographs show brick walls still standing after more than a century. rails still in place, though rusted beyond use, and empty chambers where locomotives once thundered through darkness. Other sections have been destroyed or repurposed. Some of the tunnel was filled with debris during freeway construction in the 1960s. Some segments were converted to utility corridors carrying fiber optic cables and water mains. The ventilation towers were demolished in the 1970s. Few Detroiters under age 60 even know the tunnel existed. Meanwhile, cities that never built rail tunnels are building them now. Los Angeles opened its first subway line in 1990. Seattle opened light rail tunnels in 2009. Detroit, which pioneered underground railroad operation in America, has no plans for any rail transit at all. The Michigan Central Railroad Tunnel was supposed to be Detroit's future. Instead, it became a monument to a path not taken. A reminder that sometimes solving a problem brilliantly isn't enough if the solution can't adapt to change. The Motor City buried its railroad and then buried the memory of having done so, leaving only darkness and empty tunnels beneath streets that now carry only rubber tires and exhaust fumes from the very machines that made those tunnels obsolete.